Levy, presenting for his co-authors, Dara and Mark Schniederjans. And their presentation is on equity theory-based strategies for students on overcoming problems in PhD dissertation committees. I imagine all of us have had some experience with that, so this should be quite interesting.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Levy. As Tim said, I'm from the Graduate School of Computer and Information Sciences at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale. And my two co-authors are Mark Schniederjans, who is a distinguished professor, a very famous professor in DSI, Decision Science Institute, a fellow of the DSI Institute, and a very good colleague of mine from the decision sciences area, and his daughter, which is a PhD student in Texas, that is going through the process of what most of us went through. If you did your PhD or you're doing it now, you understand the challenges and the emotional aspect of it. So we'll try to talk about some of those issues as we go along. And what started this presentation was actually a work that Mark wrote in Decision Line, which is, I don't know if anyone is familiar. Decision Line is a magazine-like type of publication that comes out from the Decision Science Institute every month or every 2 months. And they write some columns for doctoral students. So when I went through my PhD program, our professors used to require us to read those columns, and they talk about different things, and including some of the professors from the information systems field as well as decision science area are writing about their experiences and how to solve some of those issues. And so there are some collections of those columns that I collected over the years throughout my PhD. And when I started teaching in the PhD program in 2003, which is about 9.5 years ago, time flies, I started to give it to my students. And there are very interesting columns to talk about the 10 mistakes that doctoral students make and how to overcome problems. And one of them is a session that Mark wrote himself, and it's called the PhD Bill of Rights. Okay? And he wrote this in 1998. And that was a very intriguing thing for me because he, as a distinguished professor who chaired something like 15, 20 doctoral dissertations, which is considered a lot for traditional state schools, wrote about the fact that we need to treat students like human beings. And that was a surprise to me, okay? Because that's the first professor that I read that writes as a professor that we need to treat PhD students like human beings, okay? And so this is what triggers some discussions. And when I started being involved with the editorial for IJDS, the International Journal of Doctoral Studies, which I was the editor-in-chief for 6 years, I founded it, and then we moved it, and I actually asked Mark in 2005 or 2006 to rewrite that PhD Bill of Rights from a tiny column in that magazine to a full-fledged article. And he actually was happy to do that, and so we went back and forth, and he worked on a very interesting article, and I welcome all of you to actually read it. We cite it on this paper, and that started a very elaborated relationship between us. And then his daughter started a PhD program a couple of years later, and that started more discussions on how to treat doctoral students in a humane type of area. And so this is essentially a follow-up in trying to create some kind of a framework to our discussion, okay? And of course, you cannot start a good presentation without a famous quote. So the idea here is really that smart people or intellectuals are really solving problems. I'm an engineer by background, okay? So solving problems is part of what we do. But being more than that is preventing them to begin with, right? And so when you're in a situation in a doctoral relationship with an advisor, or you're the chair of a doctoral dissertation, sometimes things escalate very quickly. And so like anything else in life, right? We try to prevent things from escalating. Sometimes few words can prevent this escalation process. And that's the idea that I want to talk about today, a little bit from both aspects, the students and the professor. Okay? The outline, of course, I'll talk about the problem, which I already mentioned it a little bit. We'll talk about equity theory in general. And I'll talk about what we mean by equity theory in this context. There is a lot to talk about equity theory, and you're welcome to go to the article itself and read it and read some of the references that we used in the article for the theory. I will explain what we mean in this context and what we consider it from the professor's perspective as someone who's chairing dissertations too many, and from a doctoral student who is going through the process and remembering my experience and Mark remembering his experience. And then I'll talk about argumentation theory. I'll tell you where it came from in my perspective, what caused me to get to argumentation theory. Actually, Tim and I wrote a paper way back, I think in 2006, that we elaborate on the argumentation theory in details, and we're referring to that paper, so when we get there, I'll point to that as well. And then we'll talk about professor-student relationship, the issue of inequality, what we mean by inequity in the relationship. I'll give a couple of cases from real-life examples that we experienced, and then how to solve them. We, again, elaborate everything in the paper, and then we'll have some discussion. So what is the problem in general? The problem is that we have a situation in the Ph.D. program, in general, in doctoral programs, the dropout rates is just enormous. The documented numbers move between 40 to all the way to 80%. Depends on the programs. Okay, depends on the area, depends on schools. Brief numbers. I went through a state school in Florida, Florida International University. My PhD was a traditional business school, MIS program. They admitted 7 PhD students to the program, only 2 finished. You do the math. Okay? So this is a traditional state PhD program. In other schools, for us, we see it somewhere in the range of 40 to 50%, which is more of the average around. Where do we think that the most severe areas that cause students to decide to depart? We think that the issue is obviously the relationship with your chair. When the students are sensing that there is inequity in terms of the relationship, when there is an unfair relationship, when they don't feel the trust piece in the equation, then things starts to escalate. Okay, and this is what causing some major dropouts in programs. That's what we sense from our experience throughout that. And we think that equity theory can actually give a framework both for professors and students in how to deal with those situations. So a little bit about equity theory. And equity theory, in general, trying to look at treating a relationship and treating the relationship in a fair way. Okay? And when we say fair, different people have different levels of fairness, okay? And that's the problem. Because fairness for one person can be different than fairness for another person, okay? And it's the same thing between husband and wife. It's the same thing between a professor and a student, and we'll discuss that in a moment as well, some of these analogies, okay? But in general, the issue here is ensuring that the interactions, that the discussions, that the communication, that the inputs and outputs, we'll talk about that in a moment, will be in a fair manner. When we talk about, in general, the interactions, the whole interaction is an art. We think that this is an art. The communication is an issue of art. Some people are very good at that. Some people are very bad at that. And so you need to understand, if you're a professor or you're a student, you need to understand who you're dealing with. Okay, and I'll tell you briefly a little bit about my experience. I'm not putting down my former professor. He's a genius, no question about it. He has 2 PhDs from Penn State, one in statistics and one in decision science and information systems. And he was my dissertation chair, but I'll tell you, he had zero art when it comes to communication. Okay? So for me to communicate with him was a face-to-face 10 minutes a week. That's it. That's all I got. Okay? And I used to wait for him about half an hour to an hour. It depends on whenever he comes in. On Mondays at 4 p.m. was my scheduled time to see him. And that's it. He is not an email person. Okay, we're talking about 1999. Everyone was on the web and email. He's not an email person. Forget about getting anything in writing from him electronically. Okay? He would come to the office, open the door, not say hi to me, nothing. He will sit in his chair and then wait for me to come in. And he will come on this tiny stool, step up, pull some MISQ, ISR, whatever, throw them on the floor and say, you see these 5? Go and copy all of them and understand what's the theme goes across all these articles. What? It's an issue of communication. And so once you start getting what's going on there, he was a genius, no question about it. There was a line communicating and going through all these papers. If it was the issue of the statistical analysis, that all these papers has exactly the same statistical, they used all factor analysis. I was amazed. How did you pick up all these journals? And you knew which one, but he knew it, okay? And I picked it up. It took me a while to figure out his way of communication. Okay, so you need to understand, if you're a professor, you're a student, how do you deal with that? And how do you handle it? Some people, and my colleagues in my PhD program, after a week, said, have a good day. I don't want to see you anymore in my life. I'm going to be a real estate broker. Yeah? That's fine. That's okay. But you got to understand who you're dealing with and how you're communicating. Some people can deal with that. Some people don't. And so in terms of equity theory, the idea is, of course, he wouldn't ask me to go and wash his car like some other state professors do to their PhD students, or mow their lawns, okay, on Sunday morning. Okay, I've heard some stories, okay? I've heard some stories. Of course, in our university, we're way more professional and everything is documented online, and we have a tracking system and everything is electronically, so we cannot tell our students to wash our car, and anyway, they're not local, so that's a difficult thing to do. But the idea is really trying to treat other people in a fair way, okay? And so equity theory, what it talks about, it's very similar to what we know as return on investment, right? And most of you here have some business background, and so you're aware. Return on investment, and the idea is that I'm getting out of it what I expected by putting the inputs, right? So if I'm investing something, I'm expecting to have some back. The idea here is very similar to return on investment. Just it has to do with inputs and outputs. A person that comes into a PhD program is expected to give some work, to do some work, to advance, to do some inputs. They expect to have some outputs. The outputs can be feedback, can be advancement in stages, can be learning process, can be introduction to other colleagues, can be involved in presenting in conferences, right? Can be involved in writing papers to journals. There are a lot of outputs that an individual who goes through a PhD program can get from the process. The idea is, let me jump quickly. The idea is that there is inequality here. When there is inequality, you start having problems. Let me run quickly because Tim was flashing already at me. Quickly.